Hello everyone, welcome to the course of Survey of Major English-Speaking Countries. Today, we are going to learn Chapter 10, History of the United States. This lecture is about Lesson B, the Independence War of the United States. After 1 century and a half, the 13 colonies in North America had developed a similar American pattern in politics, economy, and the cultural life, and enjoyed the same frontier environment. The 13 colonies along the east coast of the Atlantic were Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire in New England in the northeast, Maryland, Pennsylvania, Delaware, New York, and New Jersey in the mid-Atlantic, in Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia in South. The English people and the European had become Americans, and they were ready to separate themselves from the Old World. The American Revolution officially proclaimed the birth of a new nation of Americans. On the eve of the American Revolution, while the 13 English colonies occupied the Atlantic coast, the French controlled Canada and Louisiana. Between 1689 and 1815, France and Britain fought several wars, and North America was joined into every one of them. In 1756, England and France began to fight to 7 Years' War, known in America as the French and Indian War. The English government invested soldiers and money in North America and won a great empire. The British forces captured several Canadian strong points, such as Quebec and Montreal. Britain won title to Canada and all of North America east of the Mississippi River. Britain's victory led directly to a conflict with its American colonists. The British government argued that Britain had spent large sums of money to defend their American colonists in those wars, and that the colonists, therefore, should pay a part of those expenses. As a result, the British government began to charge new taxes on sugar, coffee, textiles, and other imported goods. For example, with the passage of the Stamp Act, special tax stamps had to be attached to all newspapers, pamphlets, legal documents, and licenses. The Quartering Act, passed by the British Parliament, forced the colonists to house and feed the soldiers, but the Americans feared that new taxes would make trading difficult, and that British troops stationed in the colonies might be used to crush their civil liberties, which the colonists had therefore enjoyed. The colonial Americans insisted that they could be taxed only by their own colonial assemblies. No taxation without representation was their rallying cry. The colonists refused to obey the British laws, so the British soldiers were sent to Boston. May 9, 1768. 7 generations after John Rolfe's first tobacco harvest, the British wanted a bigger piece of action. A British custom official sprung a surprise raid on the ship, the Liberty, which belonged to John Hancock, one of the richest men in Boston. They were carrying 100 casks of imported wine and didn't want to pay duty. It's a radical act of rebellion against the taxes imposed by a king 3,000 miles away. The British seized Hancock's ship, triggered riots that swept through Boston. The king sent 4,000 soldiers to Boston to enforce his law. In Boston, there was 1 soldier for every 4 citizens. Boston and the 13 colonies were an economic powerhouse and critical to Britain. Nearly 40% of everything exported from Britain made its way to America. The fishing fleets shipped thousands of tons of salted cod to the Caribbean and returned with sugar and molasses. Boston was a melting pot and tension was building. March 5th, 1770. An angry mob roamed the streets. Thousands of people lost their jobs and blamed the British king gathering on the King Street. What happened next changed America forever. 5 people were killed on the streets by the British redcoat soldiers, and how Boston reacted would change the course of history. Silversmith and political radical Paul Revere captures the moment British soldiers killed 5 colonists in the streets of Boston. His engraving fueled the fires of revolution as the outrages spread across the 13 colonies. In 1773, a group of patriots responded to the tea tax by staging the Boston Tea Party. Disguised as Indians, they boarded British merchant ships and tossed 342 boxes of tea into the Boston harbor. British Parliament then passed the Intolerable Acts. The independence of the Massachusetts colonial government was sharply curtailed, and more soldiers were sent to the port of Boston, which was closed to shipping. The colonists responded by establishing the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, effectively removing British control of the colony outside Boston. In September 1774, representatives from the colonies gathered the First Continental Congress to respond to the crisis. It was a meeting of colonial leaders who opposed the British oppression in the colonies, met in Philadelphia. The Congress narrowly rejected a proposal to create an American Parliament. Instead, they passed a compact declaring a trade boycott against Britain. The Congress also affirmed that Parliament had no authority over internal American matters. At the same time, the colonists began to organize militaries and collect and store weapons in order to defend themselves. On April 19, 1775, the first shot was fired when 700 British soldiers went to capture a colonial armed depot in a small town of Concord near Boston. Thus, the American War of Independence began. 1 month later, a Second Continental Congress met in Philadelphia and began to assume the functions of a national government. It founded a continental army, finally resolved that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. Thomas Jefferson of Virginia, assisted by John Adams and Benjamin Franklin, drafted Declaration of Independence, which the Congress adopted on July 4, 1776. The Declaration officially proclaimed the independence of 13 North American colonies. It solemnly declared, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they were endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Most importantly, it explains the philosophy of governments. To secure the rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just power from the consent of the governed. Whenever any form of government becomes distinctive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute a new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them should seem most likely to effect their safety and happiness. The American began the Independence War with significant disadvantages compared to the British. They had no national government, no national army or navy, no financial system, no banks, no established credit, and no functioning government departments. The Congress tried to handle administrative affairs through legislative committees, which proved inefficient. The state governments were themselves brand new, and officials had no administrative experience. In peacetime, the colonies relied heavily on ocean travel and shipping, but that was shut down by the British blockades, and the Americans had to rely on slow overland travel. However, the Americans had multiple advantages that in the long run outweighed the initial disadvantages they faced. The Americans had a large, prosperous population that depended not on imports, but on local production for food, and most supplies, while the British were mostly shipped in from across the ocean. The British faced a vast territory, far larger than Britain or France, located at a far distance from home ports. Most of the Americans lived on farms distant from the seaports. The British could capture any port, but that didn't give them control over their inner land. They were on their home ground, had a smoothly functioning, well-organized system of local and state governments, newspapers and printers, and internal lines of communications. They had a long-established system of local military and provide a training ground for the national army created by the Congress. Motivation was a major asset. The Patriots wanted to win. Over 200,000 fought in the war. 25,000 died. The British expected the Loyalists to do much of the fighting, but they did much less than expected. At the onset of the war, the American had no major international allies. Battles such as the Battle of Bennington, the battles of Saratoga, and even defeats such as the Battle of Germantown proved decisive in gaining the attention and the support of powerful European nations such as France and Spain, who moved from supplying the Americans with weapons and supplies to supporting them militarily, making the war to a global stage. The new Continental Army suffered significantly from a lack of an effective training and largely inexperienced officers and sergeants. During the Independence War, General Washington made a great contribution. He designed the overall strategy of the war in cooperation with Congress. He worked closely with the soldiers who were decisive in the great victory at Yorktown in 1781. He provided leadership of troops against the main British forces in 1775 to 1777 and again in 1781. He lost many of his battles, but he never surrendered his army during that war, and he contributed to fight the British relentlessly until the war's end. He took charges of training the army and providing supplies, from food to gunpowder to tents. Washington's most important role in the war effort was the embodiment of armed resistance to the British Crown, serving as the representative man of the revolution. His long-term strategy was to maintain an army in the field at all times, and eventually this strategy worked. His enormous personal and political status and his political skills kept Congress, the army, the French, the military, and the states all pointed toward a common goal. Furthermore, he permanently established the principle of civilian supremacy in military affairs by voluntarily resigning his commission and disbanding his army when the war was won. Rather than declaring himself monarch, the War of Independence came to an end in 1781 with the victory of North Americans. The Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, and Great Britain had to recognize the independence of the United States. A new American nation was thus born.